Welcome back, Josh Bling here, and today I've got another Minecraft data pack for you. This one is called Divided, and basically what it does is it puts this barrier in your world that splits it into two halves, a survival half and a creative half. Now let me explain what I mean by that. So let's say you wanted to have a world where people could play in both survival and creative, but you didn't want them interfering too much with each other. You wanted them in the same save, but you didn't want the creative people with the ability to, go over and wreck people's houses or give people resources that they shouldn't have. So this is basically what that is. It's a way of dividing people in creative and people in survival. So this is kind of the whole thing. It's this barrier that appears when you approach this line, or well, the divide. And the divide is always going to be at x equals 0. X equals 0. That's where the barrier will show up. And so that's where I am right now. Regardless of what your world is, it'll be at x equals 0. But basically, since I'm in creative mode, the barrier won't let me through. And that's because if you had people in creative mode going to the survival side, they could interfere with builds. They could give people resources that they're not supposed to have. So creative players aren't allowed to go to the other side. However, if I'm in survival mode, and you'll notice it actually updated me to adventure mode, but I'll get there in a second. I'm actually able to pass through the barrier, and this is one of my favorite features of the data pack. It's just something that I really like watching, is this barrier balloon outwards and then the gate open through it. So this is the survival side. So over here we're free to break blocks and do whatever we like. Got some wheat seeds there, but the reason so if I go over to this side, basically I'm put into adventure mode, and the reason for that is we don't want the survival players able to take resources from the creative players. So for example, if a creative player put this block down, and this is actually part of something that I'll also get to in a second, if the creative players put down a block of emerald, the survival players shouldn't be able to pick that up because that would be resources that they gained kind of illegitimately. So that's why anyone in survival that's on this side is switched to adventure, right? But that as soon as they go back to the other side, they're in survival again, and they can break grass, start to get some wood to build a house. So yeah, that's the main features of it. I really think it's a useful tool if you want to have people go in creative mode and survival mode. Creative people can still do builds. I think the cool part about it is this barrier doesn't stay here. And that anything that the creative people build over here, the survival players can still see, and so they're kind of coexisting. So let me explain some more of the features about this. So let me go into creative mode. And the first feature that's kind of simple is that the barrier will also appear for creative players on the top and the bottom of the world. It won't replace any blocks, as you see, like this grass isn't turning into stained glass. So it won't replace bedrock at the bottom, but it will replace air. So basically, that's just to keep players from flying above and around the barrier. So you can't fly above the world, you can't fly below the world, because this barrier will just appear, and if you break it, it'll just replace. And the other thing is that inventories are kind of kept track of. And what I mean by that is, if you have ever been in creative mode at some point, and then you enter into survival mode or adventure, your inventory is cleared. And that's, again, just to keep survival players from getting resources that they shouldn't have. So let me say that again just more clearly. If you have been in creative mode at some point, any point in the game, and it's your first time switching into survival or adventure since you've been in creative mode, then your inventory will be cleared so that you don't exploit that. Yeah, and then one of the last features is if you go into spectator mode, spectators aren't actually restricted by the barrier at all. So if you're in spectator mode, you can actually go between the two halves freely. You can explore creative builds, you can explore the houses that people are building in survival. So yeah, I think it's just a cool touch that spectator players aren't inhibited by that. You see an armor stand there. Of course, armor stands are always used, but I'll get to that in a second. Now, I couldn't make this barrier perfect. It does have its flaws. One of the flaws that I had to do because of lag issues. Come on. Sometimes it's a little laggy. There's a lot of commands being run. Speaking of lag, I couldn't exactly replace all the blocks that a player can walk through, because if I listed out every single block that a player could potentially move through, it would just be too many commands executing at once, um, and it built up a lot of lag. So I had to count for the main ones. Like you'll see, there's no tall grass along this barrier, and that's because the barrier is removing it. So tall grass is one of the blocks that it replaces. Cave air, which is actually distinct, it's a different block from regular air, obviously has to be replaced. If you're in a cave, you don't want the barrier just not appearing. Water, lava, stuff like that. But some of the stuff that gets neglected are stuff like flowers. So for example, if I were to grab, let's see, trapdoor, oak trapdoor works, a trapdoor, bottom half, and I were to basically crawl through this, right? So this is kind of a flaw. Creative players can find gaps in the wall sometimes that they can crawl through. And so there is a contingency for that. Basically, you'll just see I was teleported to this emerald block. If any creative player ends up on the survival side, they'll be teleported to a spawn point that you can actually set. So you'll see if I teleport myself 5 blocks forward, I get teleported back to this spawn point again. Now, to set this spawn point, let's say I didn't want it right there and I wanted it over here, a little farther back from the barrier. It's actually really simple. All you have to do is type in the the command /function divided : set creative spawn. And just like that, the emerald block gets moved over here. You'll see it's gone over there. And the spawn point is now here. If I do the same thing, fly up to the barrier, teleport myself through, I get teleported here now instead of where I was before. And this emerald block, the cool thing about this is that it can actually be anything. Once you set the spawn point, it doesn't really matter what is there anymore. You'll still always go back to that point, just like that. So yeah, the emerald block is just kind of a placeholder to let you know that where the spawn point is now. One finicky thing about the spawn point is, though, sometimes it gets set to what seems like a random location, and I'll kind of explain that. It's not super random. It's kind of something that had to be done. So I'm going to go into a world, the divided field test. Now in this world, basically, the data pack hasn't been loaded yet. This is the first time the world will load with the data pack. And I'm in creative mode, but I'm on the survival side. So as soon as the first player enters into the data pack, after it's loaded, it will use that player as basically the basis for the first spawn point, right? Because it can't really, if there's not already a spawn point there to kind of go off of, it has to make its own spawn point for the creative players. So to make its own spawn point here, I'm just going to go in here. So basically, I'm in creative mode on the survival side, and the data pack is setting everything up for the first time. I'm just on the ground like normal, but for the chunks to load. So just like that, I've been teleported up in the air. Now, there's no good way in Minecraft to tell where the ground is. So when there's no good basis, when we don't already have a spawn point, and the game or the data pack has to make up a spawn point for the creative players, it will put it in the sky. And that's just because we know there's not going to be any land up here. Well, actually there could be if you had like an amplified world, but it's most likely that there's not going to be any land up here, because if we put it somewhere like y=60, there's a chance that in some worlds it could be underground. So I try to make this as flexible as possible. So yeah, so that's just the only kind of thing, is if you start up the world, sometimes your spawn point will be just way up in the sky. However, if I happen to be a creative player, if I had set this up and I had been on, there's the barrier. If I had set this up and I had been a creative player on the creative side, it would have actually just put the spawn point where I was standing, because it recognizes that I'm already on the creative side. But since it had to teleport me somewhere on the creative side when I wasn't there already, it just picked the sky because, again, there's probably no land up there. But not to fear, it's still just easy. I'm not going to set it so close to the barrier. It is just as easy to set the spawn point as before. We just execute that same command /function divided set creative spawn, and you can see the emerald block from up there is gone, and now it's right here. And so if I were to teleport through this barrier, I go right back to the tree. And the data pack does a good job of getting rid of the blocks when you teleport away. Sometimes there's just a little bit of lag and it takes a while for the chunks to render. But I made sure that basically if you teleport away or if you leave the game, the data pack is really good at tracking where you were and basically removing the blocks that you would have removed yourself had you had, just kind of flown away. So yeah, that's pretty much it. Feel free, I put a link to the download in the description. Feel free to download this. Just put it in the data packs folder on whatever Minecraft save you want. Feel free to play around with it. I think it's a pretty cool data pack, and I think it's cool to be able to have survival players and creative players kind of coexist and still be able to interact with each other. So yeah, that's about it. Thanks for watching.